take credit. Your father, or the character, was very reluctant to take credit for his efforts because he felt bad about threatening his family. And I guess that's an interesting moral dilemma. I mean, on the one hand, people have to resist. On the other hand, people have to protect their families. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when he explained it to me, so with all these stories, let's just say the first half of the book, I'd heard those stories all my life. The second half of the book that deals with the war, I heard the story about being chased through the woods by the German when we'd gone fishing and curfew had passed. And we were out past curfew, and their mom was really worried, and they had to sneak back at night. But the part about being in the resistance, he didn't tell me that for years. In fact, didn't really like sharing it. I mean, I don't know why, but it kind of just blurted out when we went to visit and he got up on the hill. Now, obviously, the way I wrote the book is he told me everything on the hill, and that is not exactly what happened. It was at that point in the book that he told me, you know, I did a lot of things with the resistance that at the time I couldn't share with anybody because, you know, my mom, that's all she kept saying to him was, you know, don't do anything, don't endanger the family, make sure you stay up here, you know, don't try not to go in town, all those types of things. It just, for him, it was a very emotional spot at that time. And I think that's the first time I had ever heard about it. And it wasn't until later that I really got all the stories. I mean, on the hill, he said, I was part of the resistance. I did this. I could see the airfield. He told me about some battles that he watched. He told me about an escaped prisoner. And in the book, the escaped prisoner, when I talk about him, was actually being hidden by their neighbor in their smokehouse that had collapsed. So they were sheltering the escaped prisoner. Unfortunately, they were caught, and the father was being dragged off, but the son spoke up and admitted to it and said, it was me, my father had nothing to do with it. And they took him off to Germany to a concentration camp. Now, interesting enough, my Uncle Torolf got home, was drafted, was sent to Germany because he also spoke German, was on leave, went to visit his Bestemor, and met the neighbor. The neighbor had survived the concentration camp and had said, if my dad had gone, he would be dead right now. And my uncle said he was very emaciated. He pulled up his shirt so you could see all the scars. And that's just how brutal everybody was. And I'm sure that's why my father didn't want to share that. And he definitely did not want his mom to know about it. So the story wasn't coming out until after she had passed.
Kurt, this is Dave Thomas. I'm not familiar with the book, unfortunately, but I do have a question. You showed your Google Earth map to start out with and the wonderful location of your father's house. And it overlooked the two coastlines and the airfield. Given that he was part of the resistance, are there any stories which he regaled you with regard to observation of these areas and reported on to others about what he saw?
Yeah, so my father's part in the resistance came after he graduated from school in 8th grade and was really at the last 9 months of the war. His good friend that he worked with at the nursery, who he didn't know at the time, had the job before him. He did see hauled off by the Nazis and was told he was killed. And that's when my father was asked to take his position. But again, at that time, he didn't know his friend Tor had the position. They were all very secretive about it. So from up on the hill, he told me stories about he could see submarines off the coast. He could see these small patrol boats off the coast. He could see, obviously, everything that happened at the airfield, what planes came in, what planes left, what times they came in. He reported a lot on that, the little bit of boat action off the coast. And then what I did is I spent probably 3 months trying to verify everything that he told me to get the U-boat number right, the VP boat numbers right, the type of airplanes correct. And he was spot on 90% of what he told me. So his memory was amazing in my opinion. But I think everybody's memory of the war would be the same. If you were old enough, it's something that's just ingrained in your memory and you're not going to forget.
Given the location of that house, did Germans have any suspicion whatsoever that that was a prime location and a real close lookout on that house?
Well, the house itself does not have a view of the coastline. You actually have to walk farther up the hill. And from the hill, there was an outcropping of rocks. And from there, so I want to say maybe a quarter mile up the hill from the house. So when the Germans would come and do their normal inspections and toss everything, they had no idea of that, there was a good view from there unless they were to wander up. And generally, he said they were the last house. They weren't going to really go past it.
In the book, it seemed like you indicated that when he was discovering the Germans' boats coming by and that type of thing, that he didn't really know that much about that the Germans are already pretty well into Norway.
Can you repeat that for me, Dave, please?
Yeah, in the book, it seemed like to me that he was surprised that the Germans were coming by there. He saw the boats and this type of thing, but kind of gave the impression that he didn't really know that the Germans were that far into Norway already. And it took them some time, I guess, to get to their village.
Well, I want to say from the Battle of Oslo, he said they were there within 2 weeks because they wanted to build that airfield. That part of the coastline was the closest part to England or to the UK. And at the end, they were launching buzz bombs down from the airport. He would say they dug a big tunnel into the side of the mountain and hid everything, and they would roll the buzz bombs out and only launch them at night or late in the day, and then push everything back in. And the couple of the battles he talks about are the British and the Allied forces coming over, trying to bomb the heck out of that mountain to blow everything, all those buzz bombs and everything up, of which he said they were not very successful with that. The Germans had really tunneled into the side really deep.
Were there reinforcements, or when you went back to visit, did you see some of the German fortifications and that type of thing?
There were some down by the lighthouse on the coast. There were some foundations for gun placements. He tried to take me further up beyond the lake. He said there was some towers up there where they had, they could see approaching planes, but those were all gone.
How far were they actually from Oslo?
Oh, shoot. It's hard to tell. I want to say it was an all-day trip, but everything was slow. Maybe they're 70 miles, 80 kilometers, 90 kilometers.
Okay.
It's halfway between Oslo and Bergen. Is probably the best way to put it if you came around the coast. But there were no good roads. The Germans built a few of the nice roads and bridges, but there was the trip from Spangereid, he said, took forever. And it's just because the roads were so terrible. He said the bus might have gone 10, 15 miles an hour.
That is one thing that the Germans did for Norway is in 5 years, they did build a lot of good roads.
Unfortunately, they did that everywhere.
I'd like to add, I particularly interested because my father was born in Lista and baptized in Vansekirke, so that area is very familiar to me. But he was in the States by the time the war started. But my mother's family was in Flekkefjord, just west. And there's a strong resistance story there. The family they made furniture, mostly for hospitals and schools. And they joined the resistance by trying to their effort was to get the British soldiers safely out of Norway after the occupation. And they did it. They put them in coffins alive. They made coffins and to take them across to England, believing that and correctly, that the Germans would not want to open the coffin. And so they were able to safely deliver many of these British soldiers back to safe area in the United Kingdom. However, they too, that cousin was arrested and he became a prisoner of war. But that whole southern coast of Norway was just prime for activity and for resistance.
Yeah.
So thank you for reminding me.
No, that's wonderful. In fact, my uncle Torolf managed to get a full-time job at the furniture factory, but my dad, there wasn't that much work. He had 5 or 6 different jobs, sometimes 1 day a week. The bakery was the one he did the most, was 3 days a week. He worked for a window factory, and the fact that you said that story reminded me. The window factory made coffins during the war and no longer made windows.
Right. Yeah.
And he worked there 1 day a week making coffins, along with, he also had a job at a local nursery. He just, anything he could get to work is what, job he would take.
At the end of the book, this is as the war ends, he noticed some high-ranking German officers escape.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us, I assume that's based on an actual incident?
He just said, again, he's looking at a distance through a spyglass. He has no clue who they are. He just he learned all the ranks. He learned a lot. He knew the uniforms for the Luftwaffe as opposed to the Navy or as opposed to, the other branches. And he just said they were high-ranking officers. He really, in the book, I allude to something to make a joke because that's always what you hear is people left and went to Brazil.
Yeah.
But the U-boat he spotted was right there at that time. And so I assume that he was correct that these are people who got on the boat, but as to who they really are, there's no proof of who they really are.
Mm-hmm. So there's obviously a number of people they could have been.
Yes. Any of those people that they found in Brazil, because I am fairly sure that is the U-boat that they later found in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. And I understand from my reading that there was a concern that the Germans in Norway would not surrender at the end of the war, but try to hold out as a last-ditch effort in Norway.
Yeah, my father and my Bestamore was really worried about that when they all left the house to escape because they just thought there was going to be a slash and burn. But that did not happen in their town. Now, it very possibly happened in other towns, and I'm sure it did. But they pretty much got off easy with that. They went back. And to go backwards maybe just a little bit, when the Germans came and they had no place to live, they just moved in with people. And fortunately for my Bestamore and my dad's family, their house was out of town, had no electricity, no running water, no bathroom. So nobody wanted to stay with them. They left them alone.
Yeah.
They moved down in town, and actually, if you had a house, they just moved in with you and said, you're now taking care of us.
Mm-hmm.
So down in town is where they all were, and they were just on the fringe where they were kind of left alone, other than the Germans would come up, make a routine inspection, and steal their eggs or steal whatever food they had.
Mm-hmm. And they were also assumably looking for radios and
yes,
everything that could be used for spying.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Kurt. This is Jolene. When you were showing the slides, you had the picture of the resistance pin, and I was wondering if you could say something more about when your father had to show it, and also I'm curious, like, where in the house did he hide it? So when the Germans would come and toss the house around, they wouldn't find it.
Now, those are wonderful questions and things he didn't tell me. I didn't know he had a resistance pin until he passed away. And I went through his things and I found it. And that's the same thing with the bookmark and his German ID. I'd heard about the German ID. Now, my uncle, I found out he also had a pin. So my dad never told me my uncle was in the resistance, and my uncle never told me he was in the resistance, although during many interviews, he kind of hinted that he was, but same thing, even my uncle unfortunately passed away in May, just 2 months ago at 92. But with my interviews, he never would come out and say, I was part of the resistance. I think the quote would be, I said, did you help the resistance? And he said, I did what I had to do. And that was it. He didn't really want, even at 92. He didn't want to say he was part of it. We're all sure he was, but he just wouldn't admit it to us.
Did the Germans close the schools and the churches, or did they try to make the young people into a Hitler Youth kind of organization?
So when they first came, German was now a mandatory class, and the school my father went to, again, kind of out of town, they didn't close it for 3 years. It was after about 3 years that they took over the building and used it for their own purposes. And then Mr. Dungvold, the teacher, held school in his house. There wasn't that many students at the time anyway. Now the church down in Vansa, they confiscated all the radios, and the church is a typical cross shape, and they put all the radios on the second floor and then boarded it up and closed that part off completely. So they took those, that was the first things, and that, guns, anything else that they thought was going to be a problem, they took right away.
Or if you could ask a question or answer a question about how you went about writing the book. I understand it's a work of fiction, but it's based on fact. I wonder what you can tell me about how you went about it. I mean, you started with the story, obviously, but then what kind of research did you do to, verify facts and things like that? Did you go to Norway to do research?
Well, fortunately, I still have relatives in Norway, and so I emailed them and asked them a lot of questions. My uncle, who was still alive, was very coherent right up until he was 90, and I just did personal interviews with him, of which on my website, I've actually posted a few of the interviews talking to my uncle about the war. But other research I did was basically talk to my aunt, talk to my uncle, and other relatives once my father had passed away. Now, he had written a journal and tried to recreate the journal when he came to the US. My brother has some of the pages, but I basically just wrote down stories he told me from memory and then asked my aunt and uncle, does this sound right? And the only one that I found that was maybe not a lot different, but so my dad and his two brothers are up at the lake. That's forbidden because the Germans built a dam on it and made the lake larger and used the water for down the hill for the city, for them. So this lake was forbidden to fish in. Well, by the end of the war, this was the only lake left that had fish in it. So they would go up there and fish when they knew the Germans' schedule, when they were up there and what part of the lake they could be on, and obviously stayed too late because they were catching fish and they were starving. Got surprised by the Germans, hid for a while, and then finally made a break for it. And the three of them ran in 3 different directions because there was only 2 German soldiers, knowing that one of them was going to get away. Well, when you hear the story told by my father, he makes his older brother sound like it was all his idea. He's the one that made all the noise, and the Germans chased him rather than chased him and his younger brother. And when I asked my Uncle Torolf the same thing, he told the story saying, my dad made all the noise, led them away. So it's like neither one really wanted to take credit for being part of this. They both said it was the other person. And that was a really interesting story to hear. So then I also got the point of view from Tante Thelma because she was home, and the pacing that their mother was doing, knowing it's now dark, my boys are not home, what is going on? Are they dead? Are they shot? Am I ever going to see them again? Gave me a really neat perspective of that one evening and day in their life, how I got this from 3 different sides. For me, it was my favorite story in the book. And originally, that was my cover. I changed the cover to this, but my thoughts of the cover was the 3 of them being chased by the Germans. And I fortunately had a very smart publicist who came to me and said, that cover says war story. This cover says family story. And although your book has war elements, it's really a family story. And the end of it is the war. So don't mislead the people buying your book by the cover. And because most people, that's what they do. They look at the cover and that's how they make their decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead. Shelley.
Thanks, Bill. Kurt, I wanted to applaud you in that you spoke very well you could articulate very well for a young 10-year-old. How old were they? 8, 10, 12? And then for the uncles, you had the right maturity to articulate for them. I thought that I was so absorbed and into it, because thinking that they're so young, and when you're young, you're a little immature, but you articulated it great.
Well, thank you. I really tried to change the voice of my father slightly, because he is, 8 or 9 in the beginning, and he just wants to fish. He just wants to have a good time. It's just, hey, are you taking me fishing, Uncle Tarl? Are we doing this? Are we going to do something fun? And then it slightly matures when the war comes and his life really takes a big change, and he has a completely different point of view. And I tried to make a transition in the voice, and I didn't think I did it real well, but I appreciate that you think I did. Just because it was all new to me. I'm not, this is my second book, and it's all just new, and I'm learning. I'm really hoping to get better at it with my third and fourth book.
Also, what happened with the binoculars? Do you think the bakery man went back and collected them?
I believe they did. Again, it's just a guess. We have no idea. It's possible. It was a family thing. It was a family telescope. And so I think he just figured, okay, everybody's down. Maybe I can go by and sneak it. But if anybody else had found it, I'm sure I would have heard about it. If my Bestamore had found it, or one of his brothers found it, I'm sure it would have come out.
So also, it just seems that, I try to think of the Nazis as human beings, but it seems like a lot of them they're all evil.
And that wasn't necessarily true. The way my uncle and dad explained it was the guys with the shiny boots, anybody in the SS, anybody in the Gestapo. But he said there were some, what he called regular army people, that would share pictures of their family, be nice, didn't come and ask for any food, didn't come and take anything. It was all who came to ransack the house that week. Who got sent to do it? Who did this? They didn't spend a lot of time in town. I heard in town it was terrible, because that's where the SS was and the Gestapo was all the time. They were slightly removed from everything, but not completely removed, because my father and uncle had jobs in town. So they really saw what went on, as opposed to their younger brother and their younger sister, who they really, again, if you can think about how nasty things were, you've got a house with no husband and 2 women, and lots of things went on that shouldn't have gone on. And I hate to say the word rape, but that was the big thing on their mind was, we do not want to put ourselves in a position to be taken advantage of.
Right.
And the same thing with their daughter. She was too young at the time, but by the end of the war, she's 12 years old. She's, there's a lot of strange people out there, and, they just really tried to protect them.
Yes. Thank you.
How old was your father during, from the start to the end?
Okay, so, he moved to Norway when he was 6, and he was 17 when he came back, when he left. So the last, like I say, when he really helped with the resistance, he was 16 turning 17.
Wow, okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can't imagine.
I'm still amazed by it. I've read the book 3 times and think, wow, did I actually write this? And did my dad actually do all this? And I can say he did 90% of what's in that book.
Yeah, that is, it's a difficult decision, particularly because of what the consequences would be of being found out by the Germans.
Yeah, and I think was it John who asked about it's historical fiction, and there was a big discussion on whether it should be a memoir or it should be a historical fiction, or what category does it really fall into. And I look back and think it might have been a memoir, but I couldn't verify enough of it to have it fall into that category. So for historical fiction, it's more historical fact than it is fiction, but there are parts that we kind of had to just guess at from the evidence we had, and I couldn't necessarily prove. Like at the end, I couldn't prove who those people were that got on the submarine, but I made a stab at it because that's what everybody wants to think. This is who got on the boat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you could add details.
Yeah.
One of the books, Odd Natson wrote his prison diaries. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And he does comment that many of the Germans were decent people who tried to act decently within the confines of their situation and within the limits of their situation. And while other ones, and I guess you really found out what their character is because the German system, the Nazi system, put no limits on them. So if they're going to be a horrible person, they just be a horrible person, you know.
Yeah.
You found out their true character.
Did your father or uncle ever talk about the collaborators in the area around there?
No, in fact, I guess the way to look at it is there was the Mill Org and the XU, and one did actually blowing things up, and one was just information gathering. And they worked for, well, my father worked for the information gathering side and said he could only name 2 other people. They didn't share names. They were very isolated. In fact, he never knew his friend was part of it until he was asked to take his place. He said, nobody in the resistance talked to each other about what they were doing. You talked to the person you were supposed to talk to, and that was it.
But did he talk about the Norwegians who cooperated with the Germans?
Oh, yeah, the Chrysling people, and yeah, he didn't say a lot about that. He just said it, you know, went on. It's some people were forced. Some of the Germans took wives, and unfortunately, had children, and the Norwegians didn't accept the children. But the women were forced to have the children. I didn't understand it at the time. To me, it's just like they were forced to have these kids. They were taken advantage of. What were they going to do? So, yeah. But he didn't speak very much of that at all. I guess in his town there wasn't a lot of that going on, as there would have been in other towns, you know, larger cities.
I wanted to know
it's
more.
Part of the advantage of being out of the way, you know.
I wanted to know more about those pins because I wonder if they received them at the end of the war, because something like that would be very dangerous if you're not going to be, if you're with XU, you're not going to identify yourself. So I wonder if they were given at the end of the war for service.
It's possible. I was just told that was the pin of the resistance. And like I said, I didn't know my father had one until he passed away, and my brother got it. And I got some of the other things.
Oh, hi, Janet.
Hi.
Just mention Janet Oakley is also an author. She did the book, the Jocelyn Affair, which was about the Orkney, the Shetland bus.
Oh, I know. That's a great story. I have not read your book. I now will read your book.
Well, I'm going to read yours.
Everything I've read of the Shetland bus is just amazing. I mean,
they're both great books.
Yeah, the
British.
I
recommend both.
The British Commando portion is probably my favorite part. Is when the 2 British commandos are hiding, and the Gestapo come down, and I guess this is at the very end before they burn the town, and the 2 British soldiers kill the Gestapo, and just like I think one of them escaped. Is that correct? And then came back, and that's when they had, didn't they burn the entire town down?
Oh, you're talking about Televoke. Yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to ask if your dad was working with XU, did he have a wireless transmitter?
No, he did not.
So
I found out later that was the school teacher, Mr. Dungvold, was the keeper of the transmitter.
So he just relayed by paper or in person? How did he do it?
In person.
Wow.
In person, yeah, to Mr. Ellenis.
That's awesome.
And to the other gentleman that was the doctor.
Wow.
Kurt, could you tell us a bit about how you ended up becoming an author? And then follow-up question to that, a lot of people in the lodge are maybe not trying to write a book about their families, but they are trying to write up some pages that are telling the stories that they've heard. What advice do you have for people as they try to record those family histories?
Okay, well, your first question, how did I become an author? And that would be because my children finally moved out of the house and I had free time. I'm one of those people that can't really sit still too long. I've got to have something to do. And in the winter, that was just the best thing to do. I also used to travel a lot before all the COVID. And most of this book got written while sitting on an airplane. So it took about 1.5 years to write it all down. But yeah, I would say 90% of it was probably written on an airplane. Stories. It started off again with my wife being interested in genealogy and doing her family, and then came to me and said, you know, I'm going to do your family next. Find me some good pictures, find me some good stories. And I said, well, I got plenty of good stories, and I wrote them all down. And when she was the one that read them and said, this needs to be a book, you know, you need to share this, even if it's just with the Blorstad family and other relatives in Vansa and people, you know, they need to know what was going on with your dad's life because they probably all have things to add to it. So the best thing I can tell anybody is I'm sure everybody's got a great family story. It might not be a war story, but there's some story out there, and we just need to start writing them all down.
Yeah, one of the earlier today we had a Zoom meeting with the genealogy group, and one of the discussion was how do you tell your family story? And you know, even if you write something down and it's not published, you could still pass that along. My father-in-law wrote a memoir of his around the world cruise he took in 1930, where he met my mother-in-law. And that's never been published, but it's part of the family legacy, and we've all read it and we've all enjoyed it. It's something that we'll pass on to our children. So it doesn't have to be something published, but just something written down for people to share in future generations. So, I want to just say hi, Mary Anderson is our 3rd district president is here. Do you want to say a couple words? I just noticed you.
Former 3rd district president. Kathy Dollymore is the president now.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Former 3rd district. Oh, that's still important.
All right. Your meetings are great. Kurt, this was great. And I'm happy that you're doing Zoom meetings, and I'm happy I can join.
Right. We get a wider berth. But yeah, just so like, yeah, just write things down. They don't have to be great. Janet, do you have any thoughts about writing? How do you write, since we're...
Well, I call it being bothered, but I do have a lot of family stories. One that I'm working on, it's about 1/3 done. My great-grandfather was a surgeon at the Battle of Gettysburg. So I grew up on his journals, and we found letters. So how do you incorporate that? Well, I'm going to change it out to have him start at Gettysburg. It will be fiction, but I'm bringing him to the Pacific Northwest. Because a lot of people don't know about the Civil War in the Pacific Northwest. There was a lot of shenanigans going on, partly because of Victoria, BC. Lincoln appointed the consul there, and we know he had 3 spies, which is wonderful for fiction, because if they're not identified, you can have a lot of fun creating who that person is. It won't be the character based on my great-grandfather. At the same time, I've been learning about Civil War medicine. And well, you know, even when you have a family story like that, Kurt, is that how do you put the story together? You have to set the scene. Your family pictures can help you. I use a lot of maps, and for Yossing, I had British intelligence books with maps, with train schedules, so it's great. And then I also interviewed a lot of people in the Norwegian men's choir here in my area who were in occupied Norway as young people. But I gathered the stuff. I was trained as an historian, so I gathered the stuff together and put them in files. One thing, because I knew nothing about Norway except for Kirk, Douglas movie. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah.
But Skis Against the Atoms, I started reading like crazy. But you organize it. What does this transmitter look like? What was Milorg? What was Sivborg? And I just learned about Sandborg. You're always learning something. That was the sanitary doctors group that helped work with the resistance to take care of people who were injured, and possibly maybe work with prisons, anyone who was prisoned. But you just start putting it in order, and then hopefully you have I think for historical fiction too, I find using perpetual calendars, which you can get online. So if you're writing in 1945, it might be what the calendar for 1968 looks like or something like that. And then I put in the actual event and then maybe what my character's doing. But it's a lot of organizing, and every novel is different that I've written. So it's a rabbit hole, that's what it is.
Yeah, Kurt, you mentioned the Weimar raid, and we had one of our speakers, well, this was quite a while ago, we had Klaus Hilbert, who was in the raid, speak at our lodge.
Oh, that'd be something.
That was great, yeah, and he, very interesting, he was 80 at the time, but he was, but he was very active, still skiing, and he mentioned that he really hated the Kirk Douglas movie.
Oh, I think we all did.
Because, well, and this may just be a fact that if you're doing a movie, you have to create a lot of drama. But from what he said is that they added a lot of stuff that wasn't there and a lot of conflicts that weren't there. He said that for example, that the group was very tight-knit and they had no internal disagreements, but of course they had to create more drama than really actually occurred. Yeah, but what Kurt, what in your research in Norway at that time, what surprised you the most, or what thing that you found out and said, really, gosh, I didn't know that?
Okay, that's a good question too. I honestly can't think, it's unfortunate, of anything that did surprise me because I'd heard the stories so often from my father. Other than maybe my uncle was probably also part, of getting information and giving it to the resistance.
Mm-hmm. So that was, but also moving out beyond your family history, what other things, when you did the research of Norway at the time, what other things fascinated you?
Learning about all the vessels, the airplanes, the schedules, everything that, was going on, even in a small town in that part of Norway. I mean, you knew there was a lot going on in Oslo and Bergen and different things. And yeah, they're hiding the big battleships up north. But for a little town like this, how important it was, to the Germans for their spot to launch buzz bombs against the UK. I mean, my aunt would tell me they'd sit up on the hill and watch them launch the buzz bombs, and she was just terrified, but she still had to watch it. And that was another kind of amazing thing. It's just, she was so terrified of it, but yet she still would sit there on the hill and watch it because she told me she felt a little removed from it being, at the top of the hill, not down in town and, not right there firsthand.
I understand that buzz bombs made a terrible racket.
That's what they told me.
Because I was a number of years ago, I was talking to a woman who was in World War II in England, and they would always fear when they heard the buzz bombs because they made just this loud noise. but they would really be afraid when the noise stopped, because that meant that, you know, they just ran the things, and then when they ran out of gas, then they dropped then they exploded, you know, fell to the ground and exploded. So, you know, bad as the sound was, the silence was worse. But
oh, I'm sure in England it was terrible. Anywhere in the UK.
Do we have any more questions?
I have a question, Bill. This is Irene Sandvold and Lars Heidel. I wondered if you had spent time in the Resistance Museum in Oslo, and if that helped with any of your research.
No, I have not. I didn't get to do that. I obviously went where most tourists go, other than visiting with family. You know, I went to the Longboat Museum and the art exhibits in Oslo outside, and went to Bergen and did the shops. I was really only there for 10 days. And at the time, the book was not something I even thought of. I mean, this was more just a vacation to have my father tell me about his life.
Next time you go, I really recommend it. I've been there every time, practically every time I've been there, and with Norwegian relatives, and just to go through that history of the resistance is just amazing. And I had a lot of relatives who were in the resistance in the Gjøvik and Lillemor and Hamar area and on the West Coast, and had heard some of their stories, and then putting it into perspective with what I saw in that museum. It's amazing.
Oh, I definitely have to go there. I'm trying to plan another trip, but obviously all this going on these days is in the way. But I have two cousins who have not yet been to Norway, and with their father now passed away, they've both asked me, they said, look, we want to go. Will you go the same time we do? I said, most definitely. I said, I can show you everything your father would have shown you that I've seen. I still talk to all the other relatives. I said, we got places to stay. You know, they're going to do like all good Norwegians. They're going to feed you. They're going to give you a place to stay.
Lots of blood caca.
Yeah, oh, yes. Lots of good Norwegian food.
That sounds great. Shelley has a question.
So when everybody came to America, what are the stories about what it was like? I mean, did they know English, and finding, how was it assimilating into another culture? It must have been kind of hard.
So my grandmother knew English because she had lived in the US for 5 or 6 years before she moved back. She taught my father and her children some English, but didn't teach them a lot, you know, because the Germans were there, and it's like, don't speak English anymore, just speak Norwegian. And of course they learned German. But for my uncle and my aunt, who were not allowed to come back, she helped teach them what English she knew after the war for the 2 years they were still in Norway. But yeah, they came here, they didn't speak a lot of English. They spoke a little bit, but learned very quickly.
And did they continue with the culture and the Norwegian heritage?
One of the things I don't blame my father for, but I was always kind of upset about, is I asked him at one point, I said, how come you didn't teach us Norwegian? And he was very much a Norwegian American, but more an American than a Norwegian. And he said, they don't speak Norwegian in the United States, they speak English. And you don't want to have an accent, or I didn't want you to have an accent.
Of course, it would have been a great advantage if you knew Norwegian. But
yes, it would be. You know, I understand a few words like most people, and I'm polite enough to ask for food, and, you know which ones I like, what they are, what's in them.
Fortunately, most people in Norway do speak passable English, yes.
Two of my dad's cousins are actually English teachers. They're now retired, but they taught English in the school system in Norway. So those are the two obviously I communicate with the most, but you are correct. Almost everybody, when I traveled there along the coast, I bet you at least 50% of the people spoke English well enough to understand anything I was asking them.
It sounded from the book that your uncle was a very good workmanship with wood, a carpenter. he could use his hands and everything. Did he end up, was that his life profession? And what did your
Yes.
dad end up doing?
My dad and my uncle and my bestafa all worked for the same construction company as carpenters,
Wow. Wonderful.
along with several other Norwegians that immigrated here at the same time.
Wow. And was that this area?
Yes, they right in Beltsville, Maryland.
Oh, okay. Okay.
How common at that time was for a family not to have electricity at the beginning of the war?
They were doing electricity up the mountain as the Germans came, and then it stopped. So they were just beyond. But they said they got electricity within a year of the end of the war.
Mhm. Yeah, it's amazing how the economy of, well, first of all, it's interesting that some of the events in the last part of the book happened in June 1945. Now we're exactly 75 years later talking about it, but how Norway has changed in the last 75 years. You know, from being a relatively poor country to be one of the most prosperous countries in the world. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's great for the country. All my relatives, like I say, that live there, love it. They would never leave. They say, you know, we're not coming to the U.S. They like to come and visit, but they think it's wonderful there.
Well, isn't it one of the happiest countries in the world? Or is it second in Denmark?
Well, it varies every year, you know, but usually it's in the top. Norway's in the top 3. I think last year it was number 1. I think it's a little that survey is a little arbitrary, but yeah. Yeah, it is one of the in terms of what people quantify as happy. It's one of the happiest places. Any other questions?
I have some business, Bill.
Okay. Yeah.
So I want to thank Bert for the fine opportunity to talk about your book, and a lot of us have read it, and we enjoyed that very much. So appreciate you being able to expound on it some more for us.
No, I appreciate you all having me. This is wonderful.
Yeah. Well, like again, I extend you an invitation, like you have, and come and visit the lodge in the Virginia area when you're here.
That would be great. I would also like to know, again, if I can research when my father was a member, or